Is this some kind of joke? The voice cut through the sterile air of precision arms and tactical, sharp and dripping with contempt. Bryce Addison, the shop's 34-year-old owner, stood behind his glass counter with arms crossed, a smirk twisting his face as he stared down at the old man before him. Frank Morrison, 86, didn't flinch. His back was slightly stooped from decades of carrying weight no one could see, but his eyes, clear, steady, unwavering, absorbed the hostility without reaction. He wore a faded leather jacket over a worn flannel shirt, his calloused hands resting quietly on the countertop. "I need a recoil spring guide for a 1911 A1, Frank said, his voice low and gravelly. Original from the mid-40s or something period correct. Bryce let out a harsh laugh. "A 1911? Seriously, Grandpa? That's a museum piece." He leaned forward, lowering his voice into a cruel whisper. "This is a high-end establishment. We don't carry junk parts for antiques, and frankly..." His eyes raked over Frank's modest clothes. "You don't look like our typical clientele." A young customer in tactical gear snickered. Frank slowly reached for his wallet. "Before we continue, if Frank Morrison's story moves you, type respect below. And tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the greatest heroes walk among us in silence." I read every comment. The gun shop smelled of cleaning solvent and new plastic, everything modern, sterile, expensive. Chrome display cases gleamed under LED lights, showcasing the latest polymer-framed pistols with laser sights and red dot optics. Tactical gear hung on the walls like art installations, plate carriers, night vision mounts, Kevlar helmets with rails for mounting cameras. It was the kind of place that catered to a very specific clientele. Young men with disposable income and Instagram accounts, guys who used terms like operator and tactical advantage without irony, men who paid premium prices to look like warriors without ever having been to war. Bryce Addison had built this empire from nothing. At 34, he'd parlayed a business degree and family money into a thriving gun shop that had become the go-to destination for the region's tactical enthusiast crowd. He hosted YouTube personalities, sponsored competitive shooters, and made sure his logo appeared on every online forum that mattered. He was confident, successful, and he had absolutely no patience for people who didn't fit his brand. "Did you hear me?" Bryce's voice rose, pulling the attention of the other customers. "I said we don't carry parts for museum pieces. Maybe try a pawn shop. Or, better yet," he gestured toward a display of modern handguns. "Join the 21st century. I can set you up with something you can actually handle. Lighter trigger pull, less recoil, something that won't break your wrist." His friends, two men in their late 20s wearing matching tactical pants and tight Under Armour shirts, chuckled on cue. One pulled out his phone, casually angling it toward the scene. Good content. Old man getting schooled by a successful business owner. Frank's fingers found his worn leather wallet and pulled it from his back pocket. The leather was soft from decades of use, the edges rounded and smooth. He opened it carefully, methodically, searching for his driver's license. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost meditative. The slowness seemed to enrage Bryce further. "I don't have time for this," he snapped. "You're holding up paying customers." He gestured sharply toward the door. "Either buy something modern or leave. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Frank found his license and placed it gently on the glass counter. His hand didn't shake. There was no tremor of fear or anger, only a profound, ancient patience that seemed to stretch back through decades. Bryce didn't even glance at the ID. Instead, his eyes caught something else. Frank's jacket had fallen slightly open, revealing the inner lining. Pinned there, partially hidden against the faded brown leather, was a small piece of tarnished metal. It looked old, cheap, like something from a thrift store. "What's that piece of junk pinned to your jacket?" Bryce sneered, pointing. "Win that at a county fair?" As he spoke, he reached out, not violently, but with casual dismissiveness, and placed his hand on Frank's shoulder, intending to guide him toward the door. His thumb brushed against the leather jacket, pressing for just a moment against the small, hard shape of the metal star pinned inside. The world dissolved. The smell of gun oil vanished, replaced instantly by the acrid stench of cordite and frozen earth. The LED lights became the pale, merciless sun, reflecting off endless white snow. The comfortable warmth of the climate-controlled shop transformed into cold so brutal it felt like knives in his lungs. For a split second, less than a heartbeat, Frank Morrison wasn't standing in a Virginia gun shop. He was 22 years old again, crouched behind a shattered tree stump on a Korean hillside, his M1 Garand burning hot in his frozen hands. Artillery screamed overhead. Men were shouting, some in English, most in languages he didn't understand. The taste of blood and metal filled his mouth. He felt the crushing weight of his friend's body across his back, the warm wetness seeping through both their uniforms despite the sub-zero temperature. Heard the labored breathing in his ear growing fainter. Felt the cold metal of a medal being pressed into his palm by a colonel whose face was gray with frostbite and exhaustion. You earned this, Morrison. Then it was gone. He was back in the gun shop. Bryce's hand still on his shoulder, the owner's sneering face just inches away. The tarnished silver star beneath his jacket felt impossibly heavy. Bryce shoved him. Not hard enough to make Frank fall. The old man's balance was better than it should have been, but hard enough to make a point, hard enough to establish dominance, hard enough that the other customers stopped browsing and turned to watch. I said get out, now! Frank Morrison took one step back, steadied himself, and looked directly into Bryce Addison's eyes. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply held the younger man's gaze for 3 long seconds, a look so calm and so utterly devoid of fear that something flickered across Bryce's face. Uncertainty, just for a moment. Then Frank turned and walked slowly toward the door, his worn boots making soft sounds on the polished concrete floor. The door hissed shut behind him with a pneumatic sigh. Bryce stood there, chest puffed out, victorious. His friends immediately clustered around him, one clapping him on the shoulder. "Dude, that was cold," one of them said, grinning. "Old man didn't know what hit him." "Can't have people like that in here," Bryce declared, his voice loud enough to carry through the shop. "Brings down the whole vibe. This is a professional establishment. We have standards." The other customers nodded, some uncomfortably, others in agreement. The incident was already being absorbed into the background noise of their day. Just another eccentric old man who didn't understand modern retail. But in the back corner of the shop, partially hidden behind a display of rifle cases, someone had seen everything. Corporal Marcus Evans, 24 years old, was 10 days into his leave from the Marine Corps Embassy Security Guard Detachment in Oslo. He'd come home to Virginia to see family, eat food that wasn't from a DFAC, and maybe browse some gun shops without the weight of his service uniform making every interaction formal. He wore jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. His hair was civilian length now, still short, but not the aggressive high and tight of his active duty cut. To anyone glancing at him, he looked like just another young guy interested in firearms. But Corporal Evans had noticed Frank Morrison the moment the old man walked into the shop. He'd noticed the way Frank moved, economical, deliberate, every motion serving a purpose. He'd noticed the bearing, the way the old man's spine stayed straight despite his age. He'd noticed the jacket, and more importantly, he'd noticed the faded patch on the shoulder that most people would dismiss as random vintage decoration. But Marcus Evans had been through Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island. He'd studied Marine Corps history until he could recite unit lineage in his sleep, and he knew exactly what that patch meant. 1st Marine Division. And from the wear on it, from the way it had been carefully maintained despite its age, it wasn't some surplus store costume piece. It was real. When Bryce physically shoved the old man, something cold and hard crystallized in Evans's chest. He'd seen dignitaries and foreign officials treated with more respect than this. He'd seen potential security threats handled with more dignity than this. He'd never seen an old man, a Marine if his instincts were correct, treated with such contempt for absolutely no reason. Evans set down the magazine he'd been pretending to read. He didn't storm out, didn't make a scene. He simply walked calmly to the door, pushed it open, and stepped into the bright Virginia sunlight. The parking lot was half full. SUVs and pickup trucks gleamed in their spaces. At the far end, near the concrete planter boxes that divided the strip mall sections, Frank Morrison sat on a bench. He wasn't hunched over in defeat. Wasn't crying or shaking with anger. He simply sat, hands folded in his lap, staring at the horizon with the expression of a man waiting for a bus that was 50 years late. Evans approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. Military protocol, even in civilian clothes. You don't invade someone's space without permission. "Sir," he said quietly. Frank turned his head. Those clear eyes settled on the young man, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Are you all right, sir?" Evans asked. Frank gave a slight nod. "Just catching my breath, son." What he did in there, Evans's jaw tightened. That wasn't right. Frank's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd heard variations of this statement many times before, in many different contexts, over many decades. Evans made a decision. He pulled out his phone and took one step closer. "Sir, that patch on your jacket, 1st Marine Division?" For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Frank's weathered face. "You have a good eye." "I'm a Marine, sir." "Embassy Security Group, Oslo Detachment." Evans felt his heart rate increase. If he was right about this, if his instincts were correct, then what had just happened inside that shop was about to become a much bigger problem for Bryce Addison than a bad Yelp review. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to make a phone call. I think there are some people who'd want to know how you were just treated." Frank studied the young Marine, saw the clean edge of a recent haircut, the unconscious way he stood at a modified position of attention, the controlled anger in his voice that came from discipline, not rage. He gave a slow nod. "Do what you feel you need to do, son." Corporal Evans stepped away from the bench, his thumb already scrolling through his phone's contacts. He didn't call 911, didn't call the local police. He dialed a number he'd committed to memory during his first week at Marine Corps Base Quantico, just 30 miles down Route 1. The duty phone for Gunnery Sergeant Miller. It rang twice. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller." The voice was pure gravel. Decades of shouting commands across parade grounds had left their mark. "Gunny, it's Corporal Evans." A pause. "Evans? Thought you were on leave." "I am, Gunny." Evans kept his voice low, professional, controlled. But there was an edge to it that made Miller's attention sharpen on the other end of the line. "I'm at a gun shop off Route 1, Precision Arms and Tactical, and you're not going to believe what I just witnessed. Talk to me." Evans recounted the incident with clinical precision, the insults, the dismissal, the physical shove. He described the owner's contempt, the mockery from the other customers, the way Frank Morrison had been treated like trash. Then he delivered the critical detail. "Gunny, the man he threw out, is wearing a 1st Marine Division patch. Original, not surplus. His name is Frank Morrison. He's 86 years old." There was dead silence on the other end of the line. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Evans heard what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. Then, very quietly, almost reverently, Gunnery Sergeant Miller's voice came back. "Say that name again, Corporal." "Frank Morrison, Gunny." Another pause. Longer this time. In the background, Evans could hear the faint sound of computer keys clicking rapidly. When Miller spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The harsh authority was gone, replaced by something Evans had never heard from a gunnery sergeant before. Awe. "Corporal Evans, I need you to listen very carefully. Stay exactly where you are. Do not let that man leave. I don't care if you have to buy him lunch, talk about the weather, or recite the entire Marine Corps hymn. Keep him there. I'm making a call." The line went dead. Evans lowered his phone slowly, staring at it. In 4 years of active service, he'd never heard a gunnery sergeant sound like that. Gunnies didn't do awe. They did intimidation, correction, and occasionally grudging approval. But awe, never. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to be significant. He walked back to where Frank sat on the bench and settled onto the concrete beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. Frank glanced at him but said nothing. "Sir, I hope you don't have anywhere you need to be in the next hour or so," Evans said carefully. Frank's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "At 86, son. I've learned that most things can wait. They sat in comfortable silence. A few cars came and went from the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a landscaping crew was trimming hedges, the buzz of their equipment a steady white noise. "Mind if I ask, sir?" Evans said after a while. "How long you served?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "Korea," he said finally. "Enlisted in '49, 3 years, 2 months, 17 days. Evans did the mental math. That meant Frank Morrison had been in during Chosin Reservoir? He asked quietly. Frank's eyes remained on the horizon, but something shifted in his expression. A shadow passing behind glass. Yes. Corporal Evans felt his chest tighten. He'd studied Chosin at Paris Island. Every Marine did. It was legend, mythology, and nightmare rolled into one. In November and December of 1950, approximately 30,000 United Nations troops, 15,000 of them U.S. Marines, had been surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in sub-zero temperatures at the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea. The Marines had fought their way out through 7 divisions of Chinese forces. They'd carried their wounded and their dead. They'd destroyed 7 enemy divisions in the process. It remained one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps history. The survival rate had been remarkable, the cost had been staggering, and the man sitting next to him on this ordinary Virginia parking lot bench had been there. Before Evans could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "En route, 20 minutes. Keep him there. Miller." Evans looked up from his phone and saw Bryce Addison emerge from the gun shop's entrance. The owner stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at Frank and Evans with open irritation. He was clearly annoyed that the old man hadn't left the property entirely, that he was still visible from the shop entrance, still technically loitering. Bryce pulled out his own phone and made a show of taking a photo. "I can call the cops for trespassing, you know," he shouted across the parking lot. "This is private property." Evans stood smoothly, placing himself slightly between Frank and Bryce's line of sight. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He simply stood there with the unmistakable bearing of an active-duty Marine, and after a moment, Bryce's bravado faltered. The shop owner retreated back inside, muttering something about crazy old men and their enablers. Frank hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. He simply continued to sit, hands folded, eyes on the distant tree line at the edge of the parking lot. "Sir," Evans said carefully, sitting back down, "I think the next 20 minutes are going to be interesting." Inside his cluttered office at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Gunnery Sergeant Miller stood perfectly still, staring at his computer screen. The terminal was connected to the Marine Corps Personnel Database, a system that tracked every Marine who'd ever served, living or dead, their service records digitized and classified according to sensitivity. He'd typed in the name, Frank Morrison, born 1939, service dates 1949-1952. The record that came back made his hands shake. Morrison, Frank J. Sergeant Major, retired. USMC 1st Marine Division, Korean War Service decorations, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, Navy Cross, classified action, service, record, partially redacted, clearance level, 06 and above gunnery. Sergeant Miller had been in the Corps for 23 years. He'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen other places the public would never know about. He'd earned his own stack of medals. He'd trained thousands of Marines. And he'd never seen a service record with that many black bars of redaction. He didn't call his captain, didn't call the major. He walked straight out of his office, down the polished corridor, past the administrative offices, and directly to the headquarters building. He knocked once on the door marked Base Commander and entered without waiting for permission. General David Morrison looked up sharply from his desk, ready to deliver a blistering rebuke to whoever had the audacity to enter unannounced. The rebuke died on his lips when he saw Miller's face. "Sir." Miller snapped to attention, but his voice was urgent. "Sir, I apologize for the breach of protocol, but I just received a call from one of my Marines. He's at a civilian establishment in town. He's with a man named Frank Morrison. Sergeant Major, retired. 1st Marine Division." The general's expression didn't change, but his fingers stopped moving across his keyboard. "Go on." Sir, the owner of the establishment just physically assaulted Sergeant Major Morrison and threw him out of the store. The Marine who witnessed it says the Sergeant Major was disrespected, mocked, and shoved. General Morrison's face went pale. He turned to his computer and typed rapidly, pulling up the same database Miller had accessed minutes before. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone and pressed a single button. "Get my driver. Now. And tell the ceremonial unit I want an honor guard detail assembled immediately. Full dress blues. I want them ready to move in 10 minutes. He stood, grabbing his cover from the desk. He looked at Miller. "Where is he?" "Precision Arms and Tactical, sir. Route 1. The general's jaw tightened. "I know that place. Let's go." As they strode toward the parking lot, Miller risked a question. "Sir, if you don't mind my asking, what's in the Sergeant Major's record that's redacted?" General Morrison was silent for several steps. Then, quietly, in December 1950, during the Chosin breakout, his unit was holding a hill designated .282. They were surrounded by an entire Chinese regiment, 300 Marines against 3,000 enemy soldiers. Temperature was 40 below zero. They held that position for 72 hours. He paused at the door of his vehicle. By the time reinforcements arrived, there were 43 Marines left alive. Sergeant Major Morrison was one of them. The citation for his Navy Cross is still classified because of what he did to break that encirclement. But I'll tell you this, the men who survived .282 called him the Reaper, not because of how many enemy he killed, but because of how many Marines he carried off that frozen hill alive. The two men climbed into the vehicle. Behind them, 2 Humvees full of Marines in dress blues formed up in convoy. They drove in silence, but both men understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Somewhere in Virginia, a man who'd sold overpriced tactical gear to Instagram operators had just made the worst mistake of his life. Bryce Addison was in the middle of explaining to a customer why a particular red dot sight was worth $800 when he heard it. A low rumble. Distant at first, but growing steadily louder. It wasn't the sound of regular traffic. It was deeper, more resonant, the kind of sound that carried authority. He glanced toward the front window just as the first vehicle rounded the corner into the strip mall parking lot. A black government sedan, its windows tinted dark, its profile unmistakably official. Behind it, 2 massive olive-drab Humvees, their bulk making civilian vehicles look like toys. They didn't use sirens, didn't need to. They moved with a disciplined, inexorable momentum that made everything else on the road yield instinctively. The convoy pulled into the parking lot and executed a perfect tactical formation, creating a semicircle that blocked the entrance to Precision Arms and Tactical completely. Bryce's customer stopped mid-sentence. The other people in the shop moved toward the windows, phones already out. "What the hell?" Bryce muttered. The doors of the vehicles opened simultaneously, with military precision. From the Humvees, 12 Marines emerged, not in combat fatigues, not in working uniforms, in full-dress blues, the ceremonial uniform worn at funerals, embassy functions, and events of national significance. The midnight blue jackets were immaculate. The blood stripe running down each trouser leg was perfectly straight. The white gloves were spotless. They formed 2 perfect ranks with movements so synchronized it looked choreographed. Not a single Marine was out of alignment. Not a single cover was tilted even a fraction of a degree. From the lead sedan, 2 men emerged. The first was a gunnery sergeant, his uniform bearing the weight of 2 decades of service ribbons. The second wore 2 silver stars on his collar, a 2-star general. The parking lot fell absolutely silent. Traffic on the main road slowed as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Several cars pulled into adjacent parking lots, their occupants getting out with phones raised. Bryce felt his stomach drop. General Morrison didn't look at the shop, didn't acknowledge the building or its owner. His entire focus was on the bench at the far end of the parking lot, where an old man sat with a young Marine beside him. He strode forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the asphalt, and stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Frank Morrison. The old man looked up, and for the first time since entering the gun shop, genuine emotion crossed his face. Surprise, recognition, and something that might have been weariness mixed with resignation. General David Morrison brought his hand up in the sharpest, most perfect salute a human being could execute. His voice, trained to carry across parade grounds and command battlefields, rang out clear and absolute. "Sergeant Major Morrison, General Morrison, Marine Corps Base Quantico. It is an honor, sir." Frank slowly, carefully, rose to his feet. His knees protested. His back complained. But he stood, and as he did, decades of training and discipline straightened his spine. He returned the salute. Behind the general, the honor guard executed a movement so perfectly synchronized it sounded like a single crack of thunder. 12 rifles came up in present arms, the metal-on-metal snap of their actions echoing across the parking lot. General Morrison held his salute, then turned his head slightly so his voice would carry to the stunned crowd of onlookers. "For those of you who don't know," he said, his voice formal but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled fury, "you are in the presence of one of this nation's greatest living heroes." He gestured to Frank. "This is Sergeant Major Frank Morrison, United States Marine Corps, 1st Marine Division. He fought at Incheon. He was at the Chosin Reservoir, one of the frozen chosen who fought their way out of an impossible situation against overwhelming odds. He held Point 282 for 3 days against an entire enemy regiment, saving hundreds of American lives." The general's voice dropped, becoming harder, colder. "The decorations he earned are too numerous to list, but they include the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross for actions so classified the details remain sealed to this day." He turned, and his gaze fell like a physical weight on Bryce Addison, who stood frozen in the doorway of his shop, his face the color of old paper. General Morrison walked slowly toward the gun shop. Each step was measured, deliberate, and carried the weight of institutional authority. Behind him, the honor guard remained at present arms, their rifles held high in salute. Bryce Addison felt his legs go weak. Around him, his customers, the tactical gear enthusiasts, the weekend operators, the men who'd laughed at the old man, were staring at their phones, frantically Googling Point 282 Chosin Reservoir. The results that came back made several of them go pale. General Morrison stopped 5 feet from Bryce. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The quiet intensity was far more terrifying than any shout. "You run this establishment?" Bryce managed a jerky nod. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "The United States Marine Corps," the general said, his voice carrying across the parking lot to the dozens of phones now recording the scene, "has a long tradition of supporting local businesses, particularly those that serve our veterans and active duty personnel." He paused, letting the words hang. "That support is predicated on mutual respect. Today, you failed that standard spectacularly." His eyes bored into Bryce like drill bits. "You took a man, a legend, whose boots you are not fit to polish, and you treated him like garbage. You insulted him. You mocked his service. And then you physically assaulted him." The general took a step closer. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the parking lot, every word was audible. "As of this moment, Precision Arms and Tactical is officially blacklisted. No Marine from Quantico or any surrounding installation will conduct business here. I will personally ensure every commanding officer in the region knows what happened today. You disrespected a living legend, and in doing so, you disrespected every man and woman who has ever worn this uniform." Bryce tried to speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His entire world was collapsing. His business, everything he'd built, was being destroyed in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Behind the general, Frank Morrison stepped forward. He placed a gentle hand on the general's arm. "General," he said softly, "that's enough." David Morrison turned, and the fury in his eyes softened instantly. "Sergeant Major, with respect—" "That's enough," Frank repeated. His voice was quiet, but carried absolute finality. He turned and looked at Bryce Addison. There was no anger in his face, no triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness that was somehow worse than any rage could have been. "The things you sell in that store," Frank said, gesturing toward the gleaming tactical gear visible through the windows. "They're just tools. They don't make a man strong or brave. That comes from in here." He tapped his chest gently over his heart. "Respect isn't something you demand because you've got the latest gear or the newest technology. It's something you give freely, especially to those who came before you." He paused. "Everyone carries a history, son. You just have to be quiet enough to see it." As Frank spoke, the general's eyes drifted to the old man's leather jacket, which had fallen open in the movement. There, pinned to the inside lining, was a small silver star, tarnished, worn, but unmistakable. A silver star, the third highest military combat decoration. But something about it seemed odd. The general had seen hundreds of military decorations. This one looked old, older than it should be for someone who'd served in Korea. The ribbon was faded almost to white in places. The metal had a patina that suggested decades of handling. Frank noticed his gaze and touched the metal gently. For a moment, a memory flashed behind his eyes. He was younger, 22, maybe 23, kneeling in frozen mud in a makeshift aid station. Snow was falling. Artillery thundered in the distance, and lying on a canvas stretcher before him was a kid. Couldn't have been more than 17. Baby face, eyes already glassy and distant. The kid had thrown himself on a Chinese grenade, saving Frank and 2 other Marines. He'd absorbed the blast with his own body. By the time they got him to the aid station, there was nothing anyone could do. Frank had taken his own newly awarded Silver Star, the one they'd pinned on him just hours before for another action, and carefully pinned it to the dying boy's uniform. "You earned this more than I did," Frank had whispered. The boy never heard him. He'd died 30 seconds later. The medal Frank wore now wasn't even his. It was a replacement he'd been issued later. A simple piece of metal he kept, not as a trophy for his own valor, but as a reminder of the boy whose name was carved into the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Private First Class Timothy Chen, age 17. The general understood. He'd seen enough classified citations to read between the lines. This man standing before him wasn't just a hero. He was a man who'd carried the weight of his brother's sacrifices for 70 years. He came to attention and saluted again. This time, Frank didn't return it. He simply nodded, tired and ready to go home. The convoy departed as precisely as it had arrived. The honor guard loaded into the Humvees with mechanical precision. General Morrison's sedan pulled away smoothly. Within 2 minutes, the parking lot was empty except for stunned civilians and their phones full of footage that was already being uploaded to social media. Corporal Evans stood at attention as Frank Morrison slowly walked toward an old pickup truck parked in the far corner of the lot. "Sir," Evans called, "can I give you a ride somewhere?" Frank turned, and for the first time that day, he smiled. "I'm all right, son, but thank you, and thank you for making that call." "It was my honor, sir." Frank climbed into his truck, a 1987 Ford that had seen better decades, and drove away. Evans watched until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Then he pulled out his phone and texted his father, a retired Marine he hadn't spoken to in 6 months due to a stupid argument about politics. "Dad, I love you. Let's have dinner when I'm back in town." The response came 30 seconds later. "I'd like that, son." The footage went viral in less than 4 hours. By midnight, Jacker Frank Morrison and Respect Our Veterans were trending nationally. The videos showed everything. The confrontation, the convoy arrival, the general's salute, the dress blues honor guard standing at present arms. But the most shared clip was Frank's quiet statement to Bryce Addison. "Everyone carries a history, son. You just have to be quiet enough to see it." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Precision Arms and Tactical's online presence was obliterated. 1-star reviews flooded in by the thousands. The phone rang constantly, not with orders, but with cancellations and angry calls from veterans groups. Every news outlet in Virginia ran the story. Several national networks picked it up. Bryce's serious shooter clientele evaporated overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the man who'd assaulted a chosen reservoir veteran. His vendors began quietly severing contracts. His insurance premiums tripled when his carrier saw the viral videos. 3 months later, Bryce Addison declared bankruptcy. The store was liquidated, the inventory sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. 6 months after that, a man who looked like Bryce, but without the tactical clothing and arrogant smirk, was stocking shelves at a supermarket in a town 30 miles away. He was arranging cans of vegetables when he looked up and saw Frank Morrison pushing a shopping cart down the aisle. A small girl, his great-granddaughter, sat in the child seat, chattering happily about her day. Bryce froze. His heart hammered. He wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the floor. Frank pushed his cart closer. Their eyes met. Bryce braced himself for contempt, for mockery, for the same treatment he'd given. He got none of it. Frank Morrison simply looked at him, and then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was acknowledgement. A simple human gesture that said, "I see you. I see where you are now. I see that you're still here, still trying." Then he continued down the aisle, listening to his great-granddaughter tell him about her favorite color. Bryce stood there for a long time, a can of corn in his hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Not absolution, not redemption, but the faint, fragile possibility that he might someday become a better man than he'd been. He set the can on the shelf with more care than necessary and went back to work. 3 years later, on a cold November morning, Frank Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 89 years old. The funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by over 2,000 people, active duty Marines. Veterans from 6 different wars, family members spanning 4 generations, and standing in the back, wearing a simple black suit he couldn't quite afford, was a man named Bryce Addison. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't introduce himself. He simply stood and watched as a flag was folded with geometric precision and presented to Frank's daughter. As the honor guard fired their salute, 7 rifles, 3 volleys each, 21 shots that echoed across the frozen ground, Bryce felt tears on his face for the first time since childhood. He'd never gotten the chance to apologize, never found the words or the courage, but he'd learned something from that brief encounter in a grocery store aisle. Grace isn't about whether you deserve it. It's about whether someone chooses to give it anyway. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Corporal Evans, now Sergeant Evans, noticed the man standing alone at the back. He recognized him immediately from the videos he'd seen 1,000 times. He walked over slowly and stood beside him in silence. After a moment, Bryce spoke, his voice hoarse. "I never got to tell him I was sorry." Evans was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He knew. Men like the Sergeant Major, they always know." Bryce nodded, unable to speak. "The question," Evans continued, "is what you do with that knowledge. He gave you something that day in the parking lot. And again in that grocery store, he gave you a chance. What you do with it, that's on you." Bryce watched as Frank Morrison's flag-draped casket was carried to its final resting place by 6 Marines whose movements were so precise they might have been a single organism. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "Every day I'm trying." Evans nodded. "That's all any of us can do." They stood together until the last Marine had marched away and the crowd had thinned to just family and close friends. Then they walked in opposite directions through the white stones, each carrying their own weight, each trying to live up to the example of a man who'd carried far more. The story of Sergeant Major Frank Morrison became legend, not just because of what happened in that parking lot, but because of what it represented. The truth that heroism doesn't announce itself, that the greatest acts of courage are often carried in silence. That respect is earned not through expensive gear or loud proclamations, but through quiet dignity and decades of service no one sees. His Silver Star, the replacement medal he'd worn for 70 years, was donated to the National Museum of the Marine Corps. It sits now in a glass case with a small placard explaining its history. The placard doesn't tell the whole story. It can't. Some things are too big for words. But every day, thousands of visitors walk past that case. And some of them, the ones who look closely enough, notice that the medal is positioned next to a photograph of a young Marine, baby face, eyes full of determination. Private First Class Timothy Chen. age 17. Killed in action December 8, 1950, Chosin Reservoir. The two pieces of metal that should have belonged to two different men finally together again. And in a small house in Virginia, Frank Morrison's great-granddaughter keeps his leather jacket in her closet. She's told her own children about the man who wore it, about the history he carried, about the lesson he taught without ever meaning to. Everyone carries a history. You just have to be quiet enough to see it. To everyone who typed respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.